Chronovisor. In the 1960s, Father Pellegrino Maria Ernetti, an Italian priest, claimed to have invented a time machine of what he called Chronovisor, which allowed him to see in the future and past. He described that the device looked a bit like a television. However, instead of receiving broadcasts from local transmission stations, the Chronovisor could tune into the past to allow the viewer to see and hear events that had occurred years or even centuries earlier. He claimed that the machine worked by detecting all the sights and sounds that humanity had made that still floated through space. The device supposedly enabled viewers to watch any event in human history by tuning into the remnant vibrations that are caused by every action. Even though he lacked hard evidence for these claims, he said that he had witnessed, among other major historical events, such as the founding of Rome in 53 BC. On his deathbed in 1994, he said that he attended a meeting of all the people involved in the Chronovisor at the Vatican, during which the only existing machine was destroyed. He stated that, in the wrong hands, it could create the most fearsome dictatorship the world has ever seen. Unsurprisingly, conspiracists say that the Chronovisor is still being used today and is located somewhere in the Vatican, hidden in one of the many chambers.
There is a place within the Vatican that's rarely seen. Hidden beneath the city is an underground fortress, inaccessible to the public and protected by armed guards and state-of-the-art security. The secret apostolic archives. Within the stone and steel reinforced walls are vaults, climate-controlled rooms, and over 50 miles of shelves. And on those shelves are countless texts, relics, and artifacts collected by the church for over 1,000 years. And one of the most intriguing objects hidden in the archive is called the Chronovisor, a device that can view events anywhere and any time in history. And for years, its existence was just a rumor. No proof of the Chronovisor was ever found. But a book released by a Vatican priest would change all that. Pellegrino Ernetti was a scientist, world-class authority on music, and a scholar. He also happened to be a Benedictine monk. Now, whether by luck or by fate, Father Pellegrino Ernetti found himself in the company of Francois Brune, a priest from France. And they were sharing a ferry ride down the Grand Canal in Venice. The water was calm and the trip was long, so the men struck up a conversation. They shared a love of languages, science, and history. And they were discussing different interpretations of the Bible, Ernetti said. It's possible to see what actually happened, to see the truth with your own eyes. Now, Brune thought Ernetti was joking or being rhetorical. He wasn't. Ernetti spoke of a device he had worked on hidden in the deepest, most secret levels of the Vatican archive, a device that allowed its operator to witness events anywhere and any time in the past, and it was called the Chronovisor.
Ooh, a time machine?
Well, sort of. You can't travel anywhere with the Chronovisor, but you can program it to show you certain events on a screen, like a television.
Oh boy, you can stream anything these days.
Now, Francois Brune was stunned by the story. He knew Father Pellegrino Ernetti to be a serious man. Ernetti was well-read, well-educated, and well-respected in the church. He was not one for exaggeration. Yet Ernetti claimed to have heard speeches by Napoleon and Mussolini. He visited ancient Rome. Brune wanted to know about the events in the Bible. Did they really happen? It's all true, Ernetti said. He had seen the final days of Jesus, including his crucifixion. He saw the creation of the Ten Commandments, the Last Supper, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and everything in the Bible. Now, Brune was obviously skeptical. Even though Ernetti was intelligent and talented, he didn't have the skill and knowledge needed to build this kind of device. And Ernetti agreed that he couldn't build the Chronovisor himself. He had help. In 1952, Father Pellegrino Ernetti was working on a project at the Catholic University of Milan. And being an expert in early Christian music, he was studying and restoring tape recordings of Gregorian chants. And while listening to one of the tapes, the school's founder, Father Agostino Gemelli, was convinced he heard his father's voice, even though his father was dead at the time of the recording. But what Gemelli heard was not his dead father relaying some profound message to his son from beyond the grave. What he heard was more mundane. His father arguing with someone over the price of shoe wax. Gemelli's father was a cobbler who made and sold shoes. And Gemelli thought he'd been given a gift from God. But Ernetti wondered if there was a scientific reason for this, that the sights and sounds of people in the past somehow continued to exist long after they happened. And if they did, could they be detected?
It sounds like EVPs.
Well, it does. And this technology is not that different from what we now call EVPs, or electronic voice phenomena. And since Gemelli was president of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, he was able to fund a project to explore the possibility of listening or seeing events from the past. Ernetti assembled a team of 12 scientists, but he would only reveal the names of 2. And one was Enrico Fermi, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist known for Fermi's paradox and for creating the world's first nuclear reactor. The other scientist was Nazi rocket scientist turned director of NASA, Wernher von Braun. Like sound waves can be pressed into vinyl to produce a recording, Ernetti said that his team had discovered that light and sound continue to exist as forms of energy. And using a series of antennas, the Chronovisor could detect this residual electromagnetic radiation and translate it into image and sound. Operators of the Chronovisor could designate a specific date and location, then the scene was reconstructed on a large cathode ray tube. Now, Francois Brune was obviously amazed by the story and asked Ernetti what happened to the device. Ernetti said that once the team realized what they had invented, they brought their discovery to the Pope. And since the Chronovisor could tune into any place and time in the past, it could be used as a powerful weapon. It could reveal state secrets or be used for blackmail. So Pope Pius XII worried that, in the wrong hands, the Chronovisor could launch a dictatorship unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Pope ordered the machine dismantled and forbid anyone from speaking of it. Ernetti said this was the first he's spoken of it in over 10 years. And Brune understood and agreed that a machine like the Chronovisor would be extremely dangerous, and it was probably best if it stayed hidden and dismantled. But Brune said to Ernetti, "It's too bad there's no proof that the Chronovisor actually worked." Ernetti said to Brune, "My friend, I have proof." Quintus Ennius was a writer and poet who lived during the Roman Republic between 239 and 169 BC. He's often considered the father of Roman poetry, and during his lifetime he wrote about 20 plays and an epic poem on the history of Rome called the Annals, but only a few fragments of his work survive. His final play, Thyestes, was produced shortly before his death in 169 BC, and scholars have wondered about this play for centuries. They knew the story was based on the writing of another author, Seneca, but the actual text of Thyestes, except for a few lines, has been lost to history. Ernetti used the Chronovisor to visit Rome in 169 BC, where he saw a performance of the play in a Roman square. Ernetti, fluent in Latin, was able to transcribe and finally complete Ennius's play after 2,000 years, and that manuscript still exists. The story of the Chronovisor remained hidden for another 12 years or so. Then in 1972, an article appeared in the Italian magazine La Domenica del Corriere.
Show off.
The headline of the article was, "A machine that photographs the past has finally been invented." And some believe that the Chronovisor was not dismantled, but was actually functional and being used by the church to maintain watch and control of the population.
That theory makes sense.
Oh, you believe that one, huh?
What does the Pope in the woods?
Soon, several photos were leaked. But again, the Chronovisor fell out of the public eye.
Or the information was suppressed by the church.
Or that. Well, then in 2002, Francois Brune released his book called The New Mystery of the Vatican, which documents his relationship with Ernetti and includes more details of what Ernetti saw with the Chronovisor, and even includes blueprints for the machine. And Father Pellegrino Ernetti passed away in 1994, but until his dying day, he swore the Chronovisor was real. He even published an open letter saying so. Father Francois Brune passed away in 2019, and during his life, he published multiple books and papers on theology and its relationship to quantum physics. He gave talks on EVP phenomena, communicating with spirits, and many different aspects of parapsychology. He too, until his last day, believed the Chronovisor existed and possibly still exists today. Two highly regarded and well-respected clergymen insisted that the Vatican is in possession of the most important, most advanced, and most dangerous scientific invention ever created. The Vatican denies telling the truth.
Well, I think the first thing that we should distinguish for today's presentation is that Project Pegasus, under the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, was the U.S. time-space program at the time of its emergence in the mid to late 1960s. I was initially brought into Project Pegasus by my late father, Raymond F. Basiago, who was a special projects engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company, which was the principal U.S. defense contractor involved in Project Pegasus. Sometime between September of 1967 and 68, he took me up to the old Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Wood Ridge, New Jersey. And there in Building 68 was a Tesla teleporter. It basically consisted of two gray-colored parenthesis-shaped booms that were called armatures, between which was broadcast a shimmering curtain of radiant energy. And my father explained that when we jumped through that field of energy, we would enter a tunnel in time-space, and when that tunnel closed several seconds later, we would find ourselves somewhere else in the country. And so we jumped through that field of energy, and we found ourselves in something that looked like a bluish-white tunnel, such as people report in the near-death experience. We were clearly moving at a great rate of speed, but also there was a sense that we weren't moving at all, that the universe was being wrapped around us. And when the tunnel closed, we found ourselves in the location where we were teleporting to for really the next 5 years, which was Santa Fe, New Mexico. The state capitol grounds at Santa Fe were being used by Project Pegasus as the collection area for people who were teleporting into New Mexico from different teleports around the country. My dad took me to a few other defense contractor locations in New Jersey there in my first and second grade of elementary school. And then I was brought officially into Project Pegasus in the fall of 1969, which for me was the beginning of the third grade. I was 7 and then quickly turned age 8 around the time that I signed basically a loyalty oath on Defense Department letterhead. That was in approximately early October of 1969, shortly after we know the lunar landing of July 20th, 1969. And I was in real time involved in a range of time travel activities under the aegis of DARPA that Project Pegasus was then involved in. Everything from conventional remote viewing of distant targets in real time, which is a form of psychic time travel, all the way to through the form of physio-virtual time travel that chronovisors allow, where you're immersed in a hologram and you find yourself in a past or future location, all the way through various forms of physical time travel, such as Tesla teleportation and other methodologies that were being developed to bodily teleport somebody to another location in time-space. The major emphasis of the project during those years were the chronovisors, which propagated holograms of past and future events that we were either looking at to gather intelligence about non-local events or that we were immersed in, whereby we were then relocated to those positions in time-space. Of course, in Project Pegasus, during those years, which was roughly 1968 to 72 in real time in New Jersey, we were being trained in different time travel technologies, the two major ones being the Tesla teleporter and then the chronovisor of Ernetti, Gemelli, and Fermi. The chronovisor being not a teleporter, but a device that propagated a moving color hologram of a past or future event that when we looked at the hologram, it was essentially a looking glass in which we could see a past or future event going on. However, there was a paradox, and that was that if we stood on the stage of the chronovisor while the hologram was brought in around us, we subjectively experienced going to that past time and place, at least on what I call a physio-virtual basis. In other words, on a basis that included both physical aspects and virtual aspects. The probe in which I saw dinosaurs as they existed around 100. So I looked over to my left, and I realized that my father was standing there dressed as a Pennsylvania farmer. And I turned to him and said, Dad, I didn't know that you were going to be here too. And he turned to me and said, I'm not your pa, boy, because he was dealing with the contingency of discovering that I was present at the Gettysburg location that he had been sent to several years earlier. And later, back at our home in Morris Plains, he explained that it was when I ran into you at Gettysburg that I realized you were going to be in the program, but I could see that it was several years in the future because you were older than yourself back at the house. So that was an odd experience because I didn't expect my father to be there because I just interacted with him back at East Hanover with Dr. Colgate. So I then went over to the left side of the dais again, and I had this encounter with two Union officers who questioned me about what regiment I was attached to and where it was bivouacked. And I not only couldn't tell them where my regiment was or what it was, but I didn't even know what bivouac means. So I said to them, "What's bivouac, sir?" And they ended up laughing at me when they realized, they thought I was shell-shocked, and so they just didn't harass me any further. So I then, having had these three encounters and having some attention cast my direction, I then walked about 100 paces diagonally from the front of the dais. I turned my back to the dais, knowing that Lincoln would soon be arriving because many people had gathered at this point. And I stood with my left foot forward and my right foot to the right to disguise the size 16 men's shoes that I had been outfitted in by Mr. Burns. And I looked in the opposite direction from where I knew Lincoln would soon be arriving behind me to step up onto the dais. And it was in that posture that I was captured in what's known as the Josephine Cobb image of Lincoln at Gettysburg, which is a photo that had existed in a cache of Civil War photographs that once belonged to the Civil War photographer Matthew Brady, that in 1951 it was discovered by Josephine Cobb when she was then working as a photo analyst at the National Archives, that on the dais there are several pixels that portray Abraham Lincoln. I believe as he was sitting down after arriving, because when I was still at the dais, he had not yet arrived, and that picture was taken about maybe 2 minutes after I left the dais. So I think it captures Lincoln sitting down, maybe after waving to the crowd, which has always been a matter of historical controversy. So the question is, was that the actual Gettysburg speech site, or again, because Lincoln was so prominent as a human being, and because the Gettysburg Address was of such historical significance, was I there then, or was I visiting a synthetic quantum environment? Well, certainly the photographic evidence supports the finding that after accessing the actual Gettysburg via plasma confinement, I was at the original event because I was photographed there.
Now, you have also seen a documentary, reportedly of chronovised images of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. Could you comment on that?
Right. Just as I had the opportunity to go to Gettysburg, and I did end up seeing Abraham Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address, I was very crestfallen about that. But because I had performed ably and well in Project Pegasus for the 3 years that I was officially enrolled, when I was in New Mexico living with my father in the summer of 1972, he invited his longtime friend, Mary Constance Chavez, who was known as Connie, or to her friends as Pilly Chavez, who was a native Albuquerque resident who had grown up actually in Old Town Albuquerque, and was from a prominent Spanish-American family. In fact, her cousin Dennis Chavez was arguably the most prominent senator in the history of New Mexico. So her immediate, one of her brothers, an elementary school in Albuquerque was named for. So Connie was from a prominent Albuquerque family and was almost a folkloric figure in terms of being an employee of the La Hacienda and La Placita restaurants, which were the two most popular Mexican restaurants in all of New Mexico during those years, and still are. So I had extensive interaction with Connie. She was essentially my mother away from home when I was spending time in New Mexico after teleporting there as a child attached to Project Pegasus. So my father had the opportunity to invite several people to a screening of a 20 to 30 minute black and white documentary film. Again, the 16 millimeter documentary film stock of that era. And there were this was at the Sandia National Labs outside of Albuquerque, where Connie lived and worked. And there were about maybe 15 of us, all of us attached to work that was then going on at the labs in some way. And we watched as the film captured a hologram of the crucifixion of Jesus. And as a child who had taken First Communion and was attending Sunday school at a local Benedictine Catholic parish in Cedar Knolls, New Jersey, Notre Dame of Mount Carmel Church, I certainly could identify that everything that happened in that 20 to 30 minutes of film was consistent with the accounts of the crucifixion of Jesus that are found in the New Testament. Jesus, in the images, was crucified with nails having been driven into his wrists and pinning one foot over the other. He was on about a 14-foot pole that was about as thick as a contemporary telephone pole. There was a placard above his head that said INRI. He was wearing a crown of thorns that was very full and was very jagged and had been pushed on top of his head, causing rivulets of blood to have streamed down his forehead and cheeks. He was a Caucasian male with a sort of an aquiline nose and a thin, gaunt face who was in extreme pain. His mouth was agape. He had a very bushy, dark brown beard and long hair, and a very emaciated body type. He was approximately, I would say, about 5'10", but very thin. And the events that were going on around him that we could see, and actually in separate images, the images were strobing, as if the chronovisor had tapped different locations around Jesus' cross, included women coming and praying at the foot of his cross before being driven out of the area by Roman centurions. I remember seeing what must have been Longinus holding the end of his spear and leaping up to pierce Jesus' side, which is consistent with the biblical account. The sky grew dark at one point. So, from the perspective of a Catholic Sunday school participant, what had been recorded apparently was consistent with what had been recorded in the different New Testament accounts of the crucifixion. When we left the screening, my dad turned to Connie Chavez and said, "Connie, I don't know why you're reacting like this." She had been just squirming out of her seat. She couldn't watch it. She was covering her eyes at one point, sometimes looking through her fingers. And she turned to my father and said, "Ray," she was a very devout Catholic who was always helping the nuns there at the San Felipe de Neri Church in Old Town Albuquerque. And she said, "Ray, they were crucifying my Lord. How do you expect me to act?" And he said, "I know, Connie, but we also have images." He said, "My team retrieved images that 3 days later, there's a flash of light in Jesus' crypt, 2 angels appear, Jesus stands up, and all 3 of them push the stone away, and Jesus walks out of his crypt." And she said, "You're kidding, Ray." And he says, "No, we also have images of the resurrection of Jesus." Now, I don't say that to proselytize, but just to share what I experienced in that setting. Now, that begs the question of what was being accessed via Chronovision that led to the production of that film. It was either the actual crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, or it was the actual imagery of another European male of his age and general appearance among the 600 men fitting that description who were crucified by the Roman Empire around the time that Jesus of Nazareth was, or it was a synthetic recording of the crucifixion of Jesus or another man that was stored somewhere.